For real this time.
Mahatma Gandhi once said, "A nation's greatness is measured by its treatment of its weakest members." Now, weakness for us today means financial instability, financial insecurity. I know many of us come from homes where we didn't wonder if we were going to eat that night. I know I was blessed to come from a family that was financially stable. I also know that not everyone is that lucky. And maybe some of you have experienced that a little bit here in college. The stereotype of students like us existing on ramen and Kraft mac and cheese exists for a reason. And I love Kraft mac and cheese, don't get me wrong, but I don't want to live on it for the rest of my life either. But food is expensive. Gas is expensive. Housing is expensive. Life is expensive. And I want to show you today why that's such a problem for so many of our fellow Americans. In the last several years, we've seen our purchasing power decrease. Inflation has risen and the value of the dollar has dropped like a stone. According to the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., wages have lost 6% this year due to inflation. Currently, minimum wage is $7.25, and working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, that amounts to about $15,000 annually. Not enough to raise a family of any size, as many of us who can attest to. Hillary, Katie, Dr. Clark, Ashley, and I all understand that making minimum wage without someone helping you, without someone supporting you, is simply not enough to make ends meet. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, minimum wage hit its peak in 1968 when the federal government set it at $1.60. Now, in 2014 dollars, that's about $8.40. But since then, we've lost a lot of that to inflation in recent years. So this federal push to raise the minimum wage is not about handing out free money. It's really about recovering the money that we've lost due to this inflation. So according to the Department of Labor, the minimum wage was established on the federal level in 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act. And at that point, they set it at 25 cents. But my problem is not with this act, which did a lot of great things for the labor industry. It regulated child labor, and it put standards on the lowest paid jobs. My problem, our problem, is only with where it's at today. While 21 states are doing what they can to keep wages tied to inflation, without the federal minimum in place, a lot of workers would be in trouble. Take Georgia, for instance, where the state minimum wage is still $5.15. It is the responsibility of the federal government to protect workers in states like this one that refuse to raise their minimum wage. So who's affected by this problem? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that there are 3.5 million Americans of all ages that work minimum wage. That's about 3% of the American workforce. And I know 3% doesn't seem like much, but it's important to remember that these are people. These are individuals with lives and with families that are struggling to get by. So we've talked about the problem, but I want to move forward. I want to move toward the solution. In a country where inflation has eroded the wages out from under us, it is important that we, at this time, raise our minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 per hour. This is an increase of 40%, and I know that seems like a big jump, but really when you consider in 2006, we raised minimum wage from $5.15 an hour to $7.25, and that was also 40%. The two policies are actually almost identical in how they're implemented. When I researched this last semester for American Public Discourse, when the Georgia General Assembly was considered passing this bill at a state level, I was really concerned about it. On the one hand, we can help a lot of people, we can replace the wages that have been lost, and on the other hand, we run the risk of hurting a lot of people by eliminating their jobs. When I read the Congressional Budget Office report earlier this year that stated that job loss could be expected somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million jobs. Number one, that's a really big window. That's a really big margin. And those are really big numbers. helpful about this is that those with lower incomes spend their money a lot more quickly because they don't have as much. So this puts that $5 billion almost immediately back into their local economies. On top of that, $12 billion would go to those between 1 and 3 times the poverty level. Now, Katie and Hillary, you both expressed concerns about where this money would come from. And I'm with you, because $17 billion doesn't come out of thin air. And Hillary, you mentioned specifically that you're concerned about how this would affect small businesses. And both of those are really complicated questions, and they're hard to answer, because businesses can respond in a lot of different ways. And no two ever respond the same. But they have a couple of options. Admittedly, some would lay off workers and opt for more technology or lower pay. Others, however, might actually thrive in the new situation, and they could opt to hire more low-wage workers, and that's coming out of the Congressional Budget Office report. So, an article in the Seattle Times said that businesses recuperate a lot of that cost through a couple of avenues. The first is low turnover rate, and Billy has told us in another class before that turnover is one of the highest costs a business faces. The other is through moderate price raises. And they go on to say that this could mean up to 4% increase for food and eating out, and up to a 1% increase for other goods and services. And these are pretty moderate increases, given the amount that we want to raise minimum wage. But I want to remind you that the Congressional Budget Office report said that $5 billion and $12 billion actually accounted for job loss and price increases. So this is still a net influence, a net positive for those receiving the benefits. And as far as job loss goes, experts aren't sure what's going to happen. We don't really know what the end game is going to be with employment, but we know for sure that 16 million people are going to get raises out of this program. This policy would be easy for us to implement because we laid the groundwork for minimum wage decades ago, and I've already showed you that it's not an increase unlike any we've seen before. This is actually nearly identical to our last wage hike, and the end price is modest compared to where we've been in the past. Furthermore, this plan will boost the income of those who need it the most without putting tax dollars to do so. In closing, it is a safe and effective plan to raise the minimum wage to simply re-implement the wages that have been lost to inflation. It'll provide a net positive for this economy and for its beneficiaries, and it'll help those who need a modest boost without breaking the American bank. I'd like to end by drawing your attention to the final judgment from Matthew chapter 25. The king said to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the earth. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. Truly, I say to you, as you did it to the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me."